You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
The summer is heating up with Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four.
Light 'em up, Johnny!
On July 25th.
Time to save the planet.
What's the plan?
Trust me, I hate that
It's a
plan.
bad plan. Come on.
Terrible
That's a
idea.
stupid plan.
Prepare for fantastic.
We will face this together as a family.
Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four. First steps. Only in theaters July 25th. Rated PG-13. Some material may be inappropriate for children under 13. Get tickets now.
This episode is brought to you by Starbucks. Smooth, bright, deliciously crafted. Introducing Starbucks Sansera Blend, their smoothest, brightest coffee yet. It's a new kind of light roast, one that's packed with so much flavor, it shines no matter how you brew it. So go ahead and try it hot, iced, black, or with a splash of creamer. Visit athome.starbucks.com/Sansera-blend-coffee to bring Starbucks Sansera Blend home.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 223, The Battle About Britain Part 7, Invasion Preparations. This week, a big thank you goes out to Andrew and Anton for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. The preparations made by the British government and the British military in the face of a possible German invasion in the summer of 1940 would greatly evolve over the months that they would take place. In the immediate aftermath of the French defeat and the near disasters at Dunkirk and the other evacuations from the continent, the best way to describe the preparations were that they were fueled by panic. This would be the period where some of the more theatrical preparations were made, although they did not know that they were theatrical at the time. For example, the early stages of the Home Guard would be included on that list, and we'll discuss that here in a bit. But as the summer progressed, what was initially rather small and disorganized turned instead to something much more powerful and structured. This episode begins a two-part series on these defensive preparations made between May and October 1940, with this episode focusing primarily on the early stages of those preparations up until the late summer of 1940. Even during this period, the situation would drastically change as the British Army recovered from the continental disasters that they had experienced, and the British factories began to really ramp up their production of war material. During the stressful summer months of 1940, one of our best sources of information about the mindset and morale in Britain comes from the Home Intelligence Division. If you have ever read anything about how the people of Britain felt during the war, it is likely that somewhere in the source chain for that document was the Home Intelligence Division's reports. The division had been created when the war started, and it was the idea of a young woman named Mary Adams, who would go on to lead Home Intelligence with the goal of keeping a constant finger on the pulse of the nation. Adams believed that it was crucial to understand the morale of the people if the government wanted to properly impact that morale through propaganda and other actions, and so the Home Intelligence Division was born. After a few months spent on organization, the Home Intelligence Division started publishing reports in early 1940. These Home Intelligence reports were sourced from regional information officers who were themselves members of local communities, and their goal was to get information from wherever it could be attained, and the list of sources was numerous and very diverse. They spoke to local business leaders, church members and ministers, school officials. Almost anybody who wanted to talk could be a source of information. The regional information officers then submitted their reports, which were then summarized and collated into the weekly Home Intelligence reports, with daily reports being made available after mid-May 1940. As interesting as these reports can be, there should be some real skepticism about their accuracy, and there even was skepticism at the time, with Churchill himself saying that he was concerned that they were being dreamed up by a London bureaucrat in April 1942. But there were real efforts being made by people down the chain to determine the overall feelings around Britain, and even if the reports were not perfectly accurate, they are still an interesting primary source as a way to learn more about how the people compiling the reports felt the people around them were feeling at the time, even if they did not have specific feelings for how those people felt. One of the challenges with the high-level weekly and daily reports is that they were forced to make somewhat vague statements, which, if you were to post them online today, would cause people to hound you for your sources. For example, on May 30th, with the Dunkirk evacuations underway, the report would say, quote, "Many people think the army will succeed in fighting its way out with heavy losses. Few appear to believe the situation is hopeless. The net feeling is one of suspense." But, how many were many? How few were few? Impossible to say. Then on June 17th, quote, "The public are ready and determined to follow the Prime Minister if he gives the word. But if that word is not given, there are signs that morale may change rapidly for the worst," end quote. Which reads quite positive, but almost certainly hid many of the true feelings of people around Britain. The sources of the reports did not help this problem, with the people talking to their regional information officers often knowing that they were talking to the regional information officer. So, how truthful were they? The middle of 1940 was a difficult time for anybody to be speaking out too strongly against the war. In May 1940, there would even be arrests made when anti-war protests were voiced. To try and prevent any further or future protests, the leaders of the Peace Pledge Union, who had been at the forefront of the pacifist movement in Britain during the 1930s, were told that they would be prosecuted if any anti-war campaigns began with their backing. Concerns about the growth of pockets of defeatism were a major concern during these summer months, but according to the Home Intelligence reports, the government could count on the support of most of the people to continue the war. While the morale of the people was important for resisting an invasion, it was far from the most important, and as soon as invasion fears began to rise in late May, what would have been seen as drastic measures before the war began to be put into place to ensure that preparations were being made as quickly and effectively as possible. This included wide-ranging controls over the economy and society. Under Chamberlain's control would be placed government committees that would have the power to control the labor of anybody over the age of 16, if they were required for war preparations. Similar government powers were put in place to allow any changes to any personal or public property should it be required for production or defense. These were among the many changes that were made as part of various home front committees, with many of them chaired by Attlee and Greenwood, the two members of the British Labour Party that had been brought into the coalition government when Churchill had been made Prime Minister. It is interesting to note that this provided the socialist leaders of the previous opposition party with more power than they could have ever dreamed of to remake the British economy, but they were almost required to have that authority due to lack of other options. It's not like Churchill was going to get involved in economic organization and management. He was more than happy to hand off all those topics to Chamberlain, Attlee, and Greenwood so that he could get on with fighting the war. And so the three ministers went to work on putting in place what they thought the situation required. These powers were the result of what would be called the Emergency Powers Defense Act of 1940, which would be put in place on May 23rd. It gave the British government the ability and power to put in place any regulation that was deemed necessary for defense without any need for further approval by the Parliament. One of the changes in June was a reduction in the ability of consumer goods to be produced, with the amount of supplies provided to civilian production reduced by about a third so that it could be redirected to war production. This was not the cause, but it did contribute to major gains being made in July in terms of total armament production. Production rose dramatically during these summer months, especially when compared with the numbers from earlier in the year. Part of this was due to the changes made to the economic limitations that had previously held down production, like the availability of workers and raw material, but no small part of the turnaround should be credited not to the government leaders, but instead to the workers in the factories. The factories would be working around the clock in some cases, and this meant that during the summer months, the British factories would come equal or even exceed what the Germans were producing in some critical equipment areas, like aircraft and tanks. And those workers in those factories, they were working very long hours during all of those summer months.
What if Black Friday deals were available in the summer? Don't miss week-long doorbusters at Best Buy during Black Friday in July. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
This episode is brought to you by Polestar. There's only one true way to experience the all-electric luxury SUV Polestar 3, and that's to take a test drive. It can go from 0 to 60 in as little as 4.8 seconds with the dynamic handling of a sports car. But to truly understand how it commands the road, you need to be behind the wheel. Up to 350 miles of range, the 3D surround sound system by Bowers & Wilkins. It's all something you have to experience to believe. So book your test drive for Polestar 3 today at polestar.com.
The quantities of equipment being produced, when combined with the growing organization of national resistance, would cause an increase in confidence at all levels of British society. At the highest levels, the confidence was boosted by much of the intelligence coming out of Germany as well, with some decrypted messages causing the British intelligence groups to reduce their estimates on the number of German aircraft being produced. Among the people, it was clear that preparations were being made, and even decisions that were seen as possibly very unpopular, like the attack on the French forces at Mers el-Kabir and elsewhere, would not greatly damage confidence in the path ahead. Or, as one Home Intelligence report would state, generally welcomed, and even the fact that many French sailors lost their lives has been allowed to pass with little comment. All was not perfect in the government, though, and there were growing disagreements from various areas around governmental policies. From the more traditional conservatives, those who had supported Chamberlain to the end and had only given Churchill their support due to Chamberlain doing so as well, there were concerns that the new coalition government was giving far too much power to the Labour Party, and they were using their positions for political reasons. Among the Labour Party, there were concerns about what British war aims were and what post-war Britain might look like. Attlee was getting a lot of pressure from the leftists in his party that they wanted firm statements from the government on reforms that would be put in place due to their support for the war. This would eventually cause the creation of the War Aims Committee in late August, with the remit to consider means of perpetuating the national unity achieved during the war through a social and economic structure designed to secure equality of opportunity and service among all classes of the community." End quote. Meanwhile, Churchill was also proposing his own radical changes to British society to provide for British defence, when in June he offered up Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland in exchange for the usage of Irish naval bases by the Royal Navy. This offer seems wild given the events of the last 85 years, but it did happen, and in fact the Irish leader, De Valera, would reject the idea out of concern that it would bring Ireland into the war, and also, he just did not trust British promises, which was a reasonable viewpoint given recent Irish history at the time. Churchill would also make the same offer in late 1941, and again it would be rejected. But no matter what wild ideas Churchill had or political grumblings that were happening in London, one fact remained: the Germans were preparing for an invasion, a fact that was confirmed when some of Hitler's directives during the summer of 1940 were intercepted and decrypted. They made it clear that the German military was planning their attack, and this served as a tremendously potent unifying factor in British society, and so disagreements were pushed aside due to the immediate threat. Not everyone in Britain just fell in line behind the government policies, though, and there would be many people arrested either for individual acts or by collective guilt. At the individual level, there would be arrest based on speeches and public statements that were made. For example, a 50-year-old artist, Bernard Wardle, would be arrested after he advised 2 Canadian soldiers not to fight for the British government because they were rotten to the core. The 25-year-old William Garbett would also be arrested and held for an entire year after he was quoted as saying in a cafe that he would personally be quite happy if the British Empire was destroyed, as it existed to enrich the ruling class. While these and other cases often had specific justifications, even if those justifications were questionable, there were also widespread arrests throughout the country in the wake of both the start of the war and then the German attacks into France, and then the defeat of France. The target for many of these waves of arrests were people that had recently immigrated from Germany and Italy, and particularly any men who had recently come into the country. During the opening months of the war, roughly 26,000 men fell into this category. Just over 500 had already been arrested after being judged to be a high security risk. Then in May 1940, with the German attack moving west, another and much larger wave of arrests were made, with 2,000 men in coastal areas arrested and kept in captivity. Just a few days after these 2,000, another 6,000 were also ordered to be arrested, all of those who'd previously fallen into the second highest level of concern, which was called Class B. On June 10th, when Italy entered the war, 4,000 Italian men were immediately arrested, and then after June 22nd, the remaining 17,000 German men also began to be arrested and detained, with many simply being grabbed off the streets. This meant that by the end of June, over 26,000 individuals were being held without trial and without any concern for what their political leanings actually were. This last part was actually pretty important when you realize that many of these immigrants were refugees that had left Germany and Italy specifically because they did not support the leaders that Britain was now at war with. Churchill would later say that these mass arrests and internments were a grave affront to the rights of those individuals, but he would justify his actions by claiming that the plight of Britain was so great that no actions were off limits, which to me just sounds like pretty bad justification, especially considering that the vast majority of that 26,000 had already been judged to be of either low risk or no risk at all when the war started. Just like similar incidents in other warring nations, these detainments were driven less by military necessity and more by racism and xenophobia, and Churchill and the British leaders were certainly not immune to those impulses. Switching focus over to the military side of preparations, those generally came under the purview of the Chief of the Home Forces, which up until May 1940 was General Sir Walter Kirk. During the first months of the war, Kirk and the Home Forces took a different path than what they had done during the First World War, during which specific Home Guard units had been created early in the war, and instead, the idea was that the field force would be prepared and sent to the continent, where it would theoretically assist the French in either defeating or holding off the attack of the Germans. A report near the end of 1939 would say, quote, "We wish to avoid the mistake made in the last war of raising and maintaining units and formations designed only for home defense and with no overseas role. It is a reasonable assumption that if and when all field army divisions have left the country, the risk of invasion, if it exists at all, will have been seriously diminished." End quote. Now, this view would obviously prove to be quite optimistic about what the performance of the field force would be in France and the performance of the French as well. And when Churchill took over the government, he would create a new Home Defense Executive, which served as the coordinating military body for future defense preparations, which were clearly needed, with Kirk at its head and members of all three armed services also participating. It would be from this executive that much of the organization of the following months would originate. The first order of business for the executive was to create a new force of civilian volunteers, to quickly fill out the ranks of the forces in the British Islands that were ready to meet a foreign invader. This would first be called the Local Defense Volunteers, or the LDV, which would eventually morph into the Home Guard. To fill out the LDV, appeals were made to all men between the ages of 17 and 65 to join and participate. Kirk would then retire in May and would be replaced by General Edmund Ironside. Before taking over the Home Forces, Ironside had a very long and very public series of postings in the British Army, including the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and it was because of his public profile that he was chosen for the command, with the hope being that a familiar face would provide greater confidence. On the evening of May 25th, he would write, quote, "Told that I had to take over the command in England, and organize that. I am to be made Field Marshal later, not at once because the public may think that I'm being given a sop and turned out. An honor for me and a new and most important job, one much more to my liking than the Chief of the Imperial General Staff in every way." End quote. Ironside would soon be faced with the problem of having far more men than equipment, because while many men were taken off the beaches of Dunkirk and elsewhere, they brought with them little of that equipment that was so essential to, fighting a war. In fact, at the beginning of June, the total number of modern tanks in Britain was only a bit over 200, not counting over 600 light tanks of minimal value and 132 older models of questionable utility. I mentioned the available armor numbers because one of the major challenges that Ironside would face when developing a plan to meet an invasion was the overall lack of mobility of his forces. When this lack of fighting vehicles was combined with the issues posed by the Luftwaffe, who would be very active over all of the most likely landing beaches, Ironside had some real challenges. The solution that Ironside arrived at was to form a defense based on 3 key elements. The first element was a series of divisions placed along the coast to act as a kind of outpost line, with the goal of spotting the invasion and then delaying any breakout attempts while more forces were brought in. The second element was the creation of large defensive lines, which were primarily focused on being anti-tank obstacles. Then the third element was the mobile reserves that were positioned to be able to move and meet the invasion. The forces on the beaches would obviously be the first threat, and so they had been provided with a majority of the available British field artillery, in an attempt to increase their ability to delay a German landing and then the expansion of a German beachhead. 8 of the British Army's 15 available divisions would be placed in this way along the coast. On the beaches themselves, many infantry battalions were responsible for around 2 miles or 3 kilometers of beachfront, with an internal rotation of forces within the battalion to keep some troops at the forward defensive positions while others were in reserve. At the very edge of the water, on some of the beaches, there would be obstacles put in place that were called Admiralty scaffolding, which were really just large steel scaffolding structures designed to trap and damage landing craft. This took a tremendous amount of steel, around 200 tons for just 1 mile of beach, and they often were not very useful because of the poor practices involved in anchoring and securing them in place, which meant that many of them were not in the right position at the right times. Along with the scaffolding, there were efforts made to secure the greatest friend of the defender, mines. Unfortunately for the British Army, a key oversight in pre-war war planning had been mines. The British did not have any anti-personnel mines in 1940, and in fact they had to turn to the Admiralty to try and secure any type of mine that would target infantry forces on the beaches. This would come in the form of the 50-pound mushroom mine, which contained 20 pounds of amytal explosive. This was not a perfect solution, though, because the mushroom mines would prove to be very sensitive, resulting in many premature explosions and casualties. In fact, in late September, a German bomb would land on a beach and it would set off over 500 mines, causing major issues for defensive preparations in the area and causing several casualties. One of the challenges faced by British planners was that they did not know exactly where the Germans would land, and in fact, during the first 9 months of the war from September to June, all of the plans and efforts made for anti-invasion defenses had actually been positioned on the east coast along the North Sea. This was done for the simple reason that it would be impossible for the Germans to invade from the south across the English Channel, with the French defending from the south and the British defending from the north. When the French disasters began to occur, initially British defensive planning did not change, if only due to inertia, and things continued to happen on the eastern coast, before eventually focus would shift down to the south when it was clear that the Germans would be able to use France as their jumping-off point. Behind the beach, each unit was ordered to set up a series of defensive stop lines and strong points, under the assumption that stopping the invasion on the beaches would be improbable, bordering on impossible. But regardless of exactly how their defenses were constructed, the primary goal of these forces was not to defeat the invasion, but just to delay it, to hold it in place until the mobile columns could arrive. But the quality of the defensive measures, particularly behind the beaches, would certainly help delay any German invasion. These defensive preparations, called by Ironside the GHQ line, were not on the coasts, but instead were positioned inland at areas where the British Army had a better chance of slowing the German invasion. Along with newly built bunkers and pillboxes, of which there were many, there were also efforts started to turn many of the villages in likely areas of invasion into strong defensive positions that could control roads and German movement. Anti-tank ditches were also a popular construction item. All of this construction would really start getting underway in late June, and the British construction workers were certainly prolific. There were 900 pillboxes being built in Kent alone by the end of June, and by the end of the year, 28,000 of them would be in place across Britain. This was a feat far beyond the abilities of the Royal Engineers, and so they were joined by many civilian construction companies as well. These companies would help build the pillboxes, which were protected by nearby infantry trenches, which were designed to provide support for the machine guns that were often placed within the bunkers because they were the heaviest weapon available. Anti-tank ditches would then also be dug at this time, and what mines were available were often positioned. The major problem with all of this was that many of the defenses were not positioned well, and many bore the clear tokens of expediency. This makes sense because they were mostly making things up as they went along, but it is likely that if they had been forced to use these fortifications, many of them would have been turned into poorly sited death traps. They were not in positions of mutual support, they didn't have great sight lines, they weren't constructed well. It was just a confluence of factors to mean that they would not have been great places for British defenders to be in when the Germans attacked. They probably would have been either destroyed quite quickly or surrounded and forced to surrender. And it should be remembered that all of these efforts soaked up a tremendous amount of industrial and civilian resources, whether that was concrete production, steel for reinforcement, or just man-hours put into the construction. In fact, most of them would never even be completed, both as a consequence of the time it took to build them, with many not completed by the end of 1940 when construction wound down, or because after Ironside was replaced by General Brooke in July, the entire structure of the defensive plans would change. Gone were the plans for an almost entirely static defense, and in its place was a more dynamic plan using the growing strength of the British mobile columns to meet the invader wherever they landed. And for these mobile columns, Brooke required as many of the machine guns and artillery pieces as he could assemble, and many of them had been placed in static fortifications earlier in the summer and were then removed for their new purpose. We will discuss Brooke's plans and dive more into the LVD, which would become known as the Home Guard, next episode.